what I'm going to try to do is do one of my why I don't go to church live and then edit it later. So everything's good? Okay.
Pastor Steve wanted me to do, both Pastor Steves, wanted me to do maybe 10 or 15 minutes on a couple of topics, and then we're going to do, Steve wants to do Q&A, but I don't want to do Q&A.
This is the guy who wrote the book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. And that's a very interesting title, because Christians, if you're listening to this, you believe that it takes faith, or that faith is somehow involved in your belief. And that in order to be a Christian, faith is important and involved. But with what Frank is saying in the title of his book is that if you had just a little more of this thing called faith, you could be an atheist. Now think about that. It's bizarre to me that faith is this important ingredient in your belief system, and it's made you get to the position of being a Christian, and yet if you had more of it, you would be an atheist. That title of Frank's book is very curious to me for what I just said.
I just want to do all Q, no A. Is that okay? Can we do that? All Q, no A takes all the pressure off me. Everybody gets to ask a question. No problem. All right. I want to talk first about why Christianity is true, and this is going to be very abbreviated, but we have a book called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, and one of the reasons we need to do this is because quite frequently young people get to college and they call home and say this: Dad, I don't believe in God anymore. In fact, this is not uncommon. 75% of young people who are brought up in the church walk away from the church once they leave the home, and one of the reasons...
I want to know where he gets this stat from. 75% of all believers go to college and call home and say, I'm no longer going to church. Now, I think that's what he said. I think they're still believers, but they leave the church. Now, some of them definitely leave the belief as well. But I'm curious to know where he gets this 75% stat from.
The reason for this is intellectually, they don't know why Christianity is true. You know why?
Yeah, and BJ, I agree with you. I don't think many college kids would call home, because that would disappoint. That would crush their parents if they said that.
They don't know why because we've never told them why it's true. And it's actually all not that difficult to show why Christianity is true. You only have to answer 4 questions in the affirmative to show that Christianity is true.
According to the Pew study that I've read, a lot of young people leave the church because they simply do not believe in the core propositions of the belief. So more and more young people are realizing or saying that, no, just because the Bible says something doesn't make it true. Now, this is a huge, huge problem for pastors, for apologists, for parents, that, you know what, the sacredness of holy texts is falling away quickly. But let's listen to what Frank has to say about why Christianity is true.
In other words, if you ask these 4 questions and get evidence to answer them yes, Christianity is true beyond a reasonable doubt. What are the 4 questions? Here are the 4 questions. Oh, I need sound for this back there. You got to have the sound. Where's our sound guy? Tony, go, Tony, go. Are you ready?
Tony.
Here are the 4 questions.
Is this like 70s porn music? I can hardly wait for the 4 questions. Let me know if it's too loud in the chat.
Now that's some pretty grooving music, isn't it? Yeah, that is actually from our TV show, which is on every Wednesday nights at 9 and 1, so here it'd be 7 and 11. On DirecTV channel 378. How many people here have DirecTV? Can I see your hands, please? DirecTV.
Sales pitch.
Like 6 of us. Come on, friends, don't let friends watch cable. You want to get out and have enough faith to be an atheist, you got to get DirecTV. Actually, that's not true. If you go to that website right there, crossexamine.org, at those times you can watch the show streaming live. We're also on radio every Saturday morning. Here it'd be 8 a.m. That's too early. So just get the Cross-Examined app, and you can listen to it anytime you want.
More marketing.
The Cross-Examined app. Now, why are these the 4 questions? Truth, God, miracles, and the New Testament. Now, I normally do this on a college campus in about 4 hours. So I'm just going to do it in about 4 minutes now. Just kind of give you the overview.
Just the way I like it.
First question, does truth exist? Obviously, if there is no truth, or if it's true for you but not for me, or all truth is relative, then the Bible can't be true. Of course, if there is no truth, then any book written by an atheist can't be true either, right? Now, it's obvious truth exists. If somebody says there is no truth, what question should you ask them? Is that true? Is it true that there is no truth? Because if it's true that there is no truth, the claim there is no truth can't be true, but it claims to be true. I know that can give you intellectual constipation if you think about it long enough. But that's because it's self-defeating. It doesn't meet its own standard. It's like saying, I can't speak a word in English. If somebody were to say that, you go, you just said it in English.
Okay, Christians, help me understand this. I do not understand why there is this severe pushback or thinking process that we atheists don't believe in truth. I don't know where this comes from. Maybe it comes from the postmodernism movement, but I'm with Frank here. When I hear people say, well, that's true for me, but it might not be true for you, I repulse just probably as great as Frank does when I hear these things, and I'm an agnostic atheist. So I do believe in this concept of truth, but what's important to me is how we arrive at it, Frank. That is really important, because there's a lot of people who think that what they believe is true, and yet you would say they are wrong. What they believe is false. How we arrive at what we call true is the important part, because if our method of arriving at truth is flawed, then what we think is true may be flawed. And I've talked to many Christians before who have come into the conversation saying, oh, there's only objective truth, only objective truth. And by the end of it, they admit, well, yeah, okay, there's relative truth as well. So truth is not a singular concept. There are many types of truths. There is relative truth. There is absolute truth. There is truth that changes. Let me give you some examples. My hair is blonde. Now, that's a sentence. That's a statement. But when I utter it, it's true. If someone who's a redhead who utters it, it's not true. So there is this concept of relative truth. Absolute truth. There are some axioms that by definition are absolutely true. Like, Frank, I believe it's absolutely true that I am not your God. And I think Frank would agree with me on that. And that truths actually can change. And here's an example that I think the Christians can relate to. And that is that, is it always wrong for a person to stone a practicing homosexual? The Christian has to admit that that truth has changed. That if you were an Israelite back 3,000 years ago, that it is not wrong. It would be true that it's not wrong to stone the practicing homosexual, but today they would say it is. So at least me as an agnostic atheist, I do believe in truth. I do think that this whole concept of what's true for me might not be true for you does apply in some situations, and that what we call relative truth, but in other situations it doesn't. Whether you believe a bus is coming or not, and you cross the street, you will be run over and you will die. That is true. So the way I've defined truth in the past is all those things learned by reliable methods that hopefully do reflect reality. And if your method of arriving at truth is reliable, then it should reflect reality. But there's many things in the past that we thought were true, we later learned by reliable methods that we were mistaken. So again, Christians, forgive me for this rant, but please know that me and many other people who call themselves atheists don't espouse this wishy-washy view of truth. I think where it stems from is that many people have a problem with uncertainty. And when they have this nice, objective, concrete view of truth, it gives them certainty in their life, and it gives them great comfort. But there's many things that I think, are uncertain about, and we should be embracing it and not fearing it.
It's self-defeating, or it's like saying my brother is an only child, or my parents had no kids that lived, right? These are all self-defeating statements, okay? So it's self-defeating to say there is no truth. If somebody says all truth is relative, what do you say? Is that a relative truth? No, it's an absolute truth. If somebody says there are no absolutes, what should you say? Yeah, are you absolutely sure? Or if somebody says you ought not judge, what should you say? Then why are you judging me for judging? By the way, did Jesus say don't judge? No, he...
By the way, I agree with Frank here. I think you can judge people. I think you can say, you know what? If you're a flat earther, I think you're silly. I think that's a judgment call, but I think it's based on good evidence. So Frank, please, if you ever watch this, please realize that I agree with you on a lot what you're saying here. But also please know that what you're saying is not really addressed to atheists. I think it makes Christians feel good, but a lot of atheists agree with you on a lot of these points.
He said, judge not lest you be judged. By the same standard you judge others, you be judged by that standard. So before you try and take the speck out of your brother's eye, take the log out of your own eye first, then you'll be better able to help your brother. So this is not a command not to judge, it's a command on how to judge. He's telling you to take the speck out of your brother's eye. That involves making a judgment. So look, relativism, postmodernism are false. They say there is no truth while claiming postmodernism is true. They say all truth is relative while claiming that statement isn't relative. See, you can't get away from truth. Truth is objective, it's absolute. The next question is, does God exist?
Again, some truth is objective, some truth is absolute. There are many types of truths. Today is Sunday. That is a true statement. If that statement uttered tomorrow, that exact sentence will then be untrue.
Yeah, of course he does. But
Yeah.
what evidence do we have for it? There are many arguments we go through in the book, but let me just give you one major argument. The evidence shows that space, matter, and time had a beginning out of nothing.
Evidence showed that space, matter, and time had a beginning out of nothing. Are you sure about that, Frank? Have you listened to guys like Sean Carroll, Frank? If not, I highly encourage you to do so. The Big Bang, for example, is the beginning of the expansion of the universe with its known laws. It says nothing about what happened just before the Big Bang, if even that's a correct sentence to utter, because the concept of time as we know it, how can you use the word before? It's almost a nonsensical statement. But this is a common misconception that a lot of theists have, that this Big Bang was the beginning of the universe. No, it was the beginning of the expansion of the universe with its known laws.
Once there was no space, once there was no matter, once there was no time, and the entire space-time continuum leapt into existence out of absolutely nothing. Now, what is nothing? Aristotle had a good definition of nothing. He said, nothing is what rocks dream about. That's nothing. No space, no matter, no time. Even atheists are admitting this. This is not even controversial anymore, that the universe had a beginning.
Again, are you sure about that, Frank? Have you heard of string theory? Have you heard of the multiverse? I'm not sure if you can make a dogmatic blanket statement like that.
Well, if space, matter, and time had a beginning, whatever caused space, matter, and time can't be made of space, matter, and time, right? In other words, the cause must be spaceless, timeless, and immaterial. Also powerful to create the universe out of nothing. Also personal to choose to create. Also intelligent because this universe is highly fine-tuned.
personal in order to choose to create. That's an interesting concept, what Frank just said. Because, Frank, if you're saying there was a time before the creation of the universe, that we could now say that God did something, did X, and he didn't do X before. Isn't that time? Sure, it's not seconds, minutes, and hours, Frank. But when you're saying that you have a personal deity who has thoughts, are these thoughts just kind of sponged together, or do they happen sequentially? And I would think that if they happen sequentially, I think they almost have to in order not to be contradictory. You now have a God who is bound by time. Ooh, that sounds terrible. God cannot be bound by time. But if he's a personal God, maybe he is.
Now, when you have a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, personal, intelligent cause that transcends the universe, who do we mean by that? That's what everybody means by God.
Who do we mean by that? Well, if you open your Bibles, that's who we mean by that.
So the evidence points to the fact that there is a being that transcends nature with those qualities. Third.
Okay, so I came up with a list of like 6 or 7 things that this is a powerful argument for many theists. There's a raging, burning question in almost every human being. Why are we here? Why is there something rather than nothing? How did it all start? And the answer to the question of God is comforting. It answers the question. So, but here's 6 or 7 options for Frank. So Frank, if you ever watch this, some could say that the universe has always existed, but then you have the infinite regress problem. But the people differ on whether this is actually a fallacy or a problem. So maybe the universe is eternal. Number 2, some could say that the universe did come from nothing. But what do you mean by nothing? Like Lawrence Krauss says, zero energy is nothing. But you have antimatter, anti-energy, and positive matter, positive energy. But netted out, it's zero. Option 3, some say that the universe came from an impersonal God. So whatever that means, but there is this concept of a consciousness that created the universe, but it's not a personal God, that basically set the ball in motion and the ball rolled down the hill and created the universe. Option 4, some could say that the universe came from a personal God, but there's many personal gods out there. Frank believes in one of them. Number 5, some say that the universe could be created by many gods, like different pagan beliefs. Number 6, some say that there is infinite amount of universes that create each other, that they're kind of popping in and out in correlation. But all the universes are eternal, but they do have beginnings and ends because of the multiverse theory or string theory. And then option 7, maybe there's a option that we haven't even thought of yet. Maybe even an inanimate object created the universe. Who knows? It sounds crazy, I know. But here I listed 7 options, Frank. You chose one of them. Why? Why did you choose the personal God one? Now, I know you gave some reasons. Well, it has to be this way. It has to be a God outside of time and space and matter. But I just gave you some other options here, and it seems like you just skipped over them. I posit to you, Frank, that you don't believe in your God because of this issue. It does answer questions for you, gives you some certainty and comfort, but I haven't heard your personal testimony, but my guess is this wasn't the real issue of why you believe.
Third question, are miracles possible? Obviously, the Bible can't be true if miracles are not possible. If miracles are not possible, you might as well throw the Bible away. And a lot of people have trouble with miracles. They think miracles can't occur, right? They've never seen a miracle. Miracles can't occur. How can you believe in miracles? Well, what is the greatest miracle in the Bible? What is it? A lot of people say the resurrection. No, the resurrection's an easy miracle compared to the greatest miracle. What's the greatest miracle? The greatest miracle is the first verse. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. If that verse is true, every other verse is at least possible, right? I mean, if it's true that God created the heavens and the earth out of nothing, can he do whatever he wants that's not logically impossible inside the heavens and the earth? Of course. If he can create the whole show out of nothing, can he walk on water? Look, he invented water.
Okay, so I'm an atheist, and I believe that miracles are possible. Now, I don't believe miracles actually happen, but I believe that they could happen in the future. Because as an agnostic atheist, I believe that it is possible that there is a God out there. And if there's a God out there that can do miracles, then I guess I have to say then it's possible that miracles exist. But here's the question, Frank. Whenever you believe in a miracle claim, you are stating that you believe something that's unlikely. You are believing something that's unlikely, by definition. My question to you, Frank, is why? Why do you believe in the unlikely event, especially one that you haven't seen with your own eyes? Why do you believe in the miracles of the Bible? And for example, there could be miracles out there on this planet that were caused by a God that is not your own. Why do you think your God is responsible for these miracles? Or maybe you would admit that you believe Satan actually is responsible for some of the miracles. I don't know.
Can he walk on water? Can he part the Red Sea? Can he do the Jonah miracle? For some reason, people have trouble with Jonah. I'm going, God created the universe out of nothing. Can he do the Jonah? That's easy for God to create the universe out of nothing. Well, the interesting thing is we now have scientific and philosophical evidence that the first verse of the Bible is true. That in
I don't buy that.
the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. If that's the case, every other verse in this book is at least possible. You can't say miracles are not possible because the greatest miracle...
I like, Frank, I like the way you phrase that every verse in the Bible is at least possible. If it's not logically contradictory, I agree with you there. That these miracle claims are at least possible. But again, I ask you, Frank, why do you choose to believe something that is possible and not probable? Is it probable that a man lived in a whale for 3 days? Well, no, Doug, of course not. It's not probable. But with God, all things are possible. So then, yeah, now I do believe it. You see the problem there, Frank? You are believing something that is highly unlikely because a book says so.
Has already occurred. In fact, when people say, I don't believe in miracles, I normally say, look around, you're living in one. This universe is a miracle. And people say, well, I've never seen one. Does that mean they've never occurred? By the way, if miracles occurred all the time, what good would they be? I mean, think about it. If people were popping up from the dead all over the place, would the resurrection of Christ really mean anything?
If people were popping up from the dead all over the place, would the resurrection mean anything? Frank, think about your gospel narrative. That's exactly what was happening at the time, according to your own scriptures, that people were popping up from the dead all over the place. But are you saying that the resurrection of Jesus is not that important? There's a verse in the Bible that talks about that when Jesus died, the graves were opened and the dead bodies from old were walking through the streets of Jerusalem. It seemed like resurrections were banal, pedestrian at the time, that they happened frequently, even before Jesus died.
No. I mean, you go to somebody and you go, Jesus rose from the dead for your sins. And the guy goes, so what? Uncle George just rose 2 weeks ago. Now I got to give the inheritance back. Right? Miracles, by definition, have to be rare, or we're going to think there's some sort of natural phenomenon. They have to be extremely rare if they're going to get our attention. Now, some of you are going, wait, you just said something that might not be true. You said God can do whatever he wants. It's not logically impossible. I thought God can do anything. No, there's some things God can't do. Like what? Like he can't create illogical things. Like a square circle doesn't exist. He can't create a one-ended stick. Doesn't exist. Can't create a married bachelor. Doesn't exist. Can't create an honest politician. doesn't exist. There's some things that are just too hard for God. In fact, you can do some things that God can't do, like what? Sin. Change. What's he going to change from? He's already a perfect being. Any change would necessitate a move from perfection to imperfection. He can't change. He's the standard by which everything else is measured. Now, is the New Testament true? Obviously.
Okay, so let's recap. Basically, he's saying Christianity is true because there's this concept of truth. Okay. And the universe had a beginning. Okay. And that miracles are possible. Okay. Let's see what the fourth one is.
Obviously, the New Testament doesn't have a prayer if there's no truth, no God, or no miracles. But if truth exists, God exists, and miracles are possible, then we can see if we have an accurate, historically reliable account of miracles occurring in the first century to a man named Jesus and his apostles in the 27 handwritten Greek manuscripts we put under one binding we now call the New Testament. Do these documents tell us the truth, or were they written down much later by religious zealots who embellished it and made it up? There's a chapter in the book called The Top 10 Reasons We Know the New Testament Writers Told the Truth. Let me just alliterate some of them that'll help you remember them. They all begin with the letter E. We have early testimony, most if not all the New Testament documents written prior to 70 AD. We have eyewitness testimony.
Whoa. Let's not rush through that one too quick. Most of the documents we have about Jesus was written before 70 AD. I'm just going to call that false. I'm sorry, Frank. I think you are wrong. I think you are completely mistaken. I think the consensus view from many scholars is that only Paul's writings predate 70 AD. Maybe Mark, maybe the Gospel of Mark, but even then, it's right around that area, 70 AD. And out of the 13 books that Paul wrote, the consensus view is 6 of them are forgeries, that Paul didn't even write them. The other 7, the consensus view that Paul did write that. Paul wrote in the 50s. The 50s. Now, that might sound like, oh, wow, that's really close to the events. No, it is not. It is 2 decades after the purported event. 20 years, Frank. What did you do 20 years ago? Do you remember? Could you highlight details of your life from 20 years ago, Frank? Could you really? I couldn't. Well, let's listen on.
Testimony. The documents are filled with eyewitness details that only eyewitnesses would know. In fact, in the...
Whoa. The documents are filled with eyewitness testimony that only eyewitnesses would know. Okay, Frank, please think about this for a second. You believe that, let's say, the book of Matthew was written by an eyewitness named Matthew. Did Matthew see the birth of Jesus and write the nativity scene? Was he an eyewitness to that? Of course, Frank, you would have to say no. According to the story, Matthew didn't even know Jesus till much later. So if you do not need an eyewitness to write about things like the birth of Jesus, why do you need an eyewitness for any of it? Aren't we talking about the Holy Spirit coming over man and helping them write the words of the Gospels? You don't even need to see it with your own eyes, Frank.
The book of Acts alone, there's 84 eyewitness details from chapter 13 to chapter 28. Obscure eyewitness details that only an eyewitness could know. Gospel of John has 59 of these details.
Okay. Christians, I don't know if you're aware of this, but I'm just going to come out and say this. I think the consensus view is that these Gospels were written probably 1,000 miles away from the purported event, probably in Rome, not in Jerusalem. They were written in a different language, high-level Greek, and they were written probably a lifetime after the purported event. 1,000 miles away, a lifetime later. The probability of someone knowing Jesus, the Jesus described in the Gospels, knowing Greek, being literate, and living to the age of 70, you know what the probability of that is? It's very, very low. Very low. The probability is that no eyewitnesses wrote the Gospels, and that they were written by people who probably were just hearing of the events from, I guess, firsthand people a generation later. Most of the people who, if this Jesus as described in the Gospels existed, most of the people who saw this Jesus were probably dead by the time the Gospels were written. Or so far away that they didn't even know of these books until after they were dead. Well, they wouldn't know then. But
there's also embarrassing testimony. There's a lot of embarrassing things in the Bible that they never would have made up.
This is important.
Like, for example, they all run away at the crucifixion. Who would have made that up? Or the women are the brave ones. Do you think the men would have made that up? They ran away for fear of the Jews while the women were the brave ones. Who would have made that up? Okay, now I hear this often from Christians as well. And now keep in mind the gospel story. I know some Christians get mad if I call it a story, but narrative. Let's call it a narrative. The least shall be the greatest, and the greatest shall be least. The fact that women were the first ones to the tomb, that plays right into the narrative of this, the last shall be first and the first shall be last. It's like, yeah, women were not as important as men, so to speak, but yet they were the first ones to see Jesus and get that honor, to know that he had risen. That totally plays right into the narrative, into the storyline. This is not a made-up story. It's not an invented story. In fact, if you look at the characters in both the Old and the New Testaments, they're all Olympic-quality sinners. Yes. If you look at the characters in the Gospels, they were Olympic-sized sinners. This is called literary technique, Frank. If you go to a movie at Cinemark, you will see flawed characters in the story, in the screenplay, and then they go through some type of struggle. And then there reaches a climax where the story kind of gets resolved, the conflict gets resolved, and then there's the ending. This happens over and over again in screenplays. And the Gospels is a screenplay, in my opinion. It's a passion narrative. The book of Mark, the first gospel ever written, was basically the last third is a passion play, and the first 2/3 is like a long setup, a long narrative for it. You notice that? I mean, David is a man after God's own heart. What does he do? He lies, he commits adultery, he murders, and this is supposed to be a hero? The Bible tells the warts and sins of all the characters. Yeah, and a good story should. Which shows you they're not inventing this. Why would they invent this? It shows that they're not inventing this. Why would they invent this? Again, look at any screenplay where you have flawed characters. Why would they do that? It makes for an interesting story, Frank. It also has excruciating testimony. In fact, I may talk about some of this in the next session. I may do a different sermon in the next session, if that's okay. I don't know, whatever you want. Is that okay with you, Steve? I may talk about this then. Because you've got these people who are dying for what they said they saw when they could have saved themselves. But you have people dying for what they said they saw and they didn't save themselves. Frank, how do you know this? How do you know that Christians at that time died for their belief in the resurrection? It's not in the Bible. Maybe Stephen. But the eyewitness accounts, the eyewitnesses who could have seen this Jesus, where does it say that they died for their belief? For those of you in chat, you'll realize it's in later traditions. It's in books that, Frank, you don't believe are inspired in God's word, the Apocrypha and other tradition type texts. That's where you get this from. But, Frank, consider this as well. Do you really think if, let's say, a disciple who knew Jesus well
was put on the firing squad and they say, either you recant or we're going to kill you. What if they did recant, but were still killed anyhow? Do you think that would have made it into the text of history? Maybe they did say, you know what, I actually am not sure if this is true or not. Maybe you're right. Maybe it's not true. Well, okay, but we're going to kill you for sedition anyhow. Thanks for playing. That very well could have happened.
By saying he had never risen from the dead. Why would they have done this if they were inventing the whole thing? There's also extra biblical testimony. There's 10 ancient non-Christian sources within 150 years of Jesus' life that brief.
Frank, you wonder why 75% of young Christians leave the church? It's because of things that you're just saying right now. You're talking about 10 extra biblical accounts that mention Jesus within 150 years. 150 years, Frank. None of these accounts are eyewitness accounts. None. Zero. Do you disagree with me, Frank, on this? Do you think Josephus saw Jesus? No. Where did he get his information from, Frank? And by the way, most historians think that much of what Josephus said about Jesus is a forgery, but that aside, he was the first one. He wrote it in 93. That's the first extra biblical report of Jesus in 93. The next one's 112. And then most of them are in the 3rd century. Where did they get their information from, Frank? Correct answer is they got it from Christians. Frank, it's like saying, Mormonism is true because a historian wrote what some Mormons told him back in the late 1800s. It's basically that, Frank. You're saying because these guys reported on the beliefs of a certain cult, certain religion, that it therefore must be true. No, that's not the case at all. You can see that immediately if you think of the Mormon example.
Briefly mentions Jesus and the apostles, and when you line up what they say about what happened to Jesus and the apostles, it's congruent with the New Testament. There's also expected testimony. That's Old Testament prophecy. If I only had one Old Testament prophecy to make my case on, it would be Isaiah chapter 53. Have you ever read Isaiah chapter 53? If you've never read it, go home and read it. In fact,
again, Frank, do you think that atheists like me just haven't read Isaiah 53? Do you think that people who really study this stuff, that they read Isaiah 53 and they go, oh, what was I thinking? Of course it's Jesus. Oh, oy vey. It has to be. No, there's people smarter than both of us combined, Frank, that have read Isaiah 53 and do not come to the conclusion that it's talking about Jesus. Especially, I don't know how many Orthodox rabbis you talk to, Frank. They will tell you, if you read the chapters prior to Isaiah 53, the suffering servant. If you look in most Bibles, Isaiah 53 starts in actually Isaiah 52, verse 13. And the title on top is the suffering servant. Who is the suffering servant, Frank, in the chapters prior to Isaiah 53? The correct answer is Israel. Israel is the suffering servant. Now, I've listened to a lot of rabbis who are fluent in Hebrew, who cherish the Torah like it's the sweet honey on their lips. And they will tell you, Frank, that a lot of the English translations have actually changed some of the wording to make it sound like a singular individual in Isaiah 53. But actually, if you read the original Hebrew, it's clearly talking about Israel. So I guess a shout out to my Jewish friends out there who are probably giving me a high five in cyberspace right now when I say this, but it is not this slam dunk thing, Frank, that, you read Isaiah 53 and it's just like centuries before the fact, it predicts Jesus. It would have been a little better if it talked about Jesus' name, it would be Jesus, and that he would have 12 disciples, and that, a little more detail would be good. But again, regardless, it's talking about Israel.
Start in chapter 52, verse 13, and take it to the end of 53. Ask yourself as you're reading it, who is this about? It's about Jesus, yet it's written 700 years in advance. So there's a lot of information that the New Testament's telling the truth. Now, some of you are going, well, what about the Old Testament? You believe the Old Testament's true? Well, yeah, we do, but if the New Testament's reliable, you get the Old Testament thrown in. Why? Who's in the New Testament that can authenticate the Old Testament? Jesus, right? If Jesus really is God, as the New Testament documents claim he is, then whatever God teaches is true. Jesus taught the entire Old Testament as the Word of God, so if the New Testament's reliable, you get the Old Testament thrown in. Now, there's a lot more detail on this in the book, but the bottom line here is if the New Testament's reliable, you get the Old Testament thrown in. Now, what I just said...
Okay, here's the problem with that. Or not a problem, but let me give Frank and all the believers in Frank something to chew on. Frank's saying that if the New Testament's true, then the Old Testament comes in for free. Basically, it has to be true as well. But Frank, would you admit to me that the Old Testament could be true and the New Testament false? In other words, that it doesn't work the other way around. I agree with you, Frank, that if the New Testament is true, then the Old Testament is true. But going the opposite direction may not be the case. Now, this is, I guess, for my Mormon and my my Jewish and my Muslim friends. They're going to really love me for saying this. But if the Old Testament, if the Torah is true, and if the New Testament is false, you are, Frank, you are committing the worst sin ever. You are an idolater. You are believing that God is this Jesus person and Jesus is this God person. You're taking a huge risk here. I'm going to play Pascal's wager back at you here. You're taking a huge risk that the New Testament is true and that Jesus is God. Because if he isn't, I tell you, God's going to look more favorably upon atheists than guys like you, Frank. Because we just don't believe, but you're purposely believing in a false God. You better hope you're right, Frank. I hear hell's a bad place.
Said there in 10 minutes, can take hours to get through. If you want to see some of the slides for this, you can just go into your browser and type in crossexamine.org/Billings in the next day or two. If you send us your email address, I'm going to send you these slides in a PDF format so you can go through them out by yourself at your leisure. Also, the books are available on the book table if you're interested in that. All right, that's the overview of why Christianity is true, because truth exists, God exists, miracles are possible, and the New Testament's telling us the truth. If the New Testament's telling us the truth, the entire Bible is true. All right? Now, Steve wanted me to talk about another issue, a very controversial issue that's inflicting not only society but the church.
Oh, yeah, I remember this. He starts talking about homosexuality now. I don't want to get into a whole new different topic of homosexuality. I want to do a separate video on that because of the Beauty and the Beast Disney film that just came out. I want to do a special video on that. But let me check my notes. I'll edit this out later. Yeah, I said everything there. Oh, yeah, okay. So he starts talking about homosexuality, and then, but then he talks about evolution. Now, so I'm going to fast forward it here to where he talks about evolution. And let me just say this up front. I've recently changed my mind on this. Let's see here. Okay. I used to think that the flat earth, this is going to bother a lot of Christians, but I used to think the flat earthers were like way more out there and crazy than the creationists. But you know what? I'm changing my mind on that. I think I've changed my mind on that. I think we need to treat creationists the same way as flat earthers. I'm talking about creationists who believe in a young earth, 6,000 years old, don't believe in speciation, common descent, those types of creationists. There are a lot of Christians out there who do believe in evolution and old Earth and all these things. But maybe you guys disagree with me on this one, but I almost think that we need, and you know me, I'm not the type of guy who ridicules and does like firebrand, but I'm starting to think that we need to treat Christians, young earthers, with the same level of ridicule as the flat earthers. In fact, maybe whenever you say the word creationist, throw in flat earth as a suffix to it. The creationists, flat earthers. And if they push back and say, no, I believe the earth is a globe. Well, yeah, but you believe the same. Every piece of evidence that you put forth to a young earther, their responses and their evidences that they throw back at you remind me time and time again of a flat earther. It's like there's nothing you can say. It's like the evidence can be right in front of them. And it's like, no, I can't see it. And so, I don't know, you guys can tell me in chat what you think about that, but I'm starting to think that I just need to cognitively treat young earth creationists the same way as flat earthers. Okay, let's see what he has to say about Richard Dawkins and evolution. I think I queued it up to the right spot.
Interpreted. Let me just give you one example of this. You asked Richard Dawkins, who's the top probably evolutionist in the world right now, the top atheist in the world, and he was asked, what's the best evidence for macroevolution? And he said, a common genetic code. We all have a common genetic code, so that implies a common ancestor, okay? First of all, we don't have a common genetic code. There's at least 20 different codes out there, but let's just say there is a major code, a dominant code. Let's just say for the sake of argument, Dawkins is right, that we do have a common genetic code. Does a common genetic code necessarily prove we had a common ancestor?
Now listen to this.
Does it? What's the other possible interpretation of the data? Common designer, right? But you know what Dawkins has done? He's philosophically ruled that out of existence before he's even looked at the evidence. He said there can't be intelligence, only a natural cause can be the cause. So it doesn't matter how much the evidence points towards intelligence, he's always going to say it was a natural cause. That's why he's always going to say it was a common ancestor. Notice he doesn't have a mechanism for this. He says natural selection, but natural selection can't get us there. We need a code first. Where are we getting the code from? And there's new information. It's all in the Stealing from God book.
Okay. So I actually transcribed this 1 minute that he just said, and I changed a few words. So tell me what you guys think of this. So instead of Richard Dawkins was asked, what's the best evidence for macroevolution? Frank Turek was asked, what is the best evidence for God? And he said that space, matter, and time had a beginning out of nothing. Does this necessarily prove that there's a God? Does it? What's the other possible interpretation of the data? String theory or multiverse, right? But what Turek has done is philosophically ruled that out of existence before he's even looked at the evidence. He said that there can't be a natural cause. Only a supernatural God can be the cause. So it doesn't matter how much evidence points to a natural cause. He's going to say that it was a supernatural cause. That's why he's always going to say it was God, and more specifically, the God described in the Bible. Notice Frank doesn't have a mechanism for this. He says that God is outside of time and space, but that can't get us there. We need to account for this God's existence first. Where are we getting that God from? So if you play back the tape, I basically, almost word for word, took what he said about Richard Dawkins and applied it to him. So what I'm trying to say here is, maybe, Frank, if you value truth and I value truth, should we not be able to put our deeply held beliefs on a shelf just for a moment and look at the evidence as much as we can unbiasedly and ask questions like, well, what do we expect to see if there is a God? What do we expect to see if there isn't? And then look at the evidence and answer those types of questions honestly. By the way, I don't think Richard Dawkins actually says that there can't be a God. I think he's like on the Dawkins scale, he's pretty close to 7, but he's he realizes that you cannot prove a negative and that maybe there is a God. I think he, like most atheists who see the contradictions within the nature of the biblical God, kind of put that, saying, no, that can't exist. But, so yeah, I thought that was very interesting, what he said about Richard Dawkins. So Frank is an apologist that appeals to a certain demographic of Christianity. And it tends to be the demographic of Christianity that is on the fundamental side, that tends to have this bad perception of, let's say, college, universities, that they're there to pollute your mind, that they're there, that they almost have this view that there's even some scientists that are doing the works of the devil, that no, they're not just people who are trying to make a living, but no, they're actually part of this deception plan, this conspiracy theory to deceive the young Christian's mind. And what it tends to be is Frank and his the people who like Frank, it ultimately comes down to hell. They, I think, believe in hell more so than the belief in Jesus. That the belief in hell supersedes the belief in Jesus. And here's why I'm saying this. If there is no hell, if there is no concept of the separation from God, why do you need Jesus? Answer, you don't. So this belief in hell comes first. And notice this belief of hell only arrived, when the concept of people suffering for eternity in hell within the Christian doctrine only came when Jesus came. You've heard of the good news, right? Well, the good news came with the bad news. It's like there's this hell and there's this consequence of sin, and that's eternal damnation. But I have good news. So that was the bad news. The good news is you can be saved from it. Most Jews, I could be wrong about this, but most Orthodox rabbis will not tell you that this concept of people suffering in torment for eternity, it's not part of Judaism. This is a fairly recent concept within Christianity. It's like a doctor going around with a knife and cutting people and saying, oh, and I'm selling you the Band-Aids or the stitches. So the good news of the gospel was necessarily tied in with the bad news of hell. And I'm going to play a clip later that I think will speak greatly to it.
Book. There's new information that we've just discovered that...
Let me, I have some notes here, 4450, here we go.
Building. You need both. Yes, sir.
In your illustration, you...
Okay. Oh, this is the Q&A section. I want you to listen carefully to this man's question. A Christian man is asking Frank a question.
You indicate that we send our kids to college and they come back without their faith. And I have some involvement with a Christian college here in Billings, and one of my arguments has been exactly that. Don't send them there. But there's another side of that coin too, which is we need to be salt and light. Mm-hmm. Could you comment just a little bit on that horns of a dilemma?
Yeah, if you're going to send them, I would say no matter what college you send them to, you've got to ensure they're inoculated, because even some Christian colleges, I don't know what Christian college you're...
You got to make sure your Christian young people are inoculated. Are you hearing yourself, Frank? Can you imagine if a Muslim apologist was to say, you know what? Before your young people go to the United States and exposed to the Christian culture and the Christian churches and the Christian universities, you need to inoculate them. Make sure they do not waver in doubt from their belief in Allah. What would your feeling, what would be your perception of those people, Frank? Of people of different religions, saying that they actually have to inoculate their young people. in order to keep them safe. And what are we keeping them safe from? Like, what is the real issue here, Frank? Why is it bad? Okay, this is going to upset some people. Why is it bad, Frank, for young Christian people to leave the faith? Ultimately, what's the problem here? And if you're honest, and if you're a Christian watching this, you're going to have to say, well, ultimately, Doug, you could say, well, you're going to miss out with a tremendous loving relationship with Jesus Christ, your Savior. But someone could say, well, so what? I'd rather have a relationship with someone that I can actually touch and feel and hug. And I'm not big on relationships anyhow. I don't need Jesus to be moral. A lot of Christians admit this. A lot of Christians admit that you do not need to be a Christian to be moral, and that you can have relationships with real people. So what is the ultimate badness? What's the worst that could happen if a Christian leaves the Christianity? It ultimately ends up being carrots and sticks. You won't go to heaven, and you'll end up in a really nasty place called hell. And this, I think, is why a lot of young people, a lot of millennials are leaving the church, because they realize that ultimately this is what it's about. This concept of hell. And a lot of young people are really asking themselves, do I have good reasons to believe this hell even exists? Just because the Bible says it doesn't mean it's true. Right, Frank? Another issue here, Frank. You say that you need to inoculate the young Christians before they go to college. But don't you believe, Frank, that God chooses the believer and the believer doesn't choose God? It's in the Bible. I'm not sure if you're a Calvinist, Frank. You're definitely an evidentialist, and I respect you for that. I'm surprised you haven't become a presuppositional apologist like most of your apologetic friends have. But really, aren't guys like me, agnostic atheists who ask questions politely of Christians, aren't we doing you a favor? Ultimately, aren't we helping you cull the herd, weed out the deceived Christians? Don't you want guys like me on the front line questioning your young people and helping you sort which ones are the true Christians and which ones are the false ones? In fact, Frank, shouldn't you be paying me to come to universities or churches, youth groups, and helping you, sort out who are the true ones and who are, just the pretenders? No one, Frank, no one can take a child of God from the Father's hand. Don't you believe that, Frank? So what are you worried about? About colleges changing the minds of the young believer? I know you're feeling me. If you're a Christian listening to this, I think a lot of what I'm saying you're going to agree with, especially if you're a Calvinist. So really, if what you believe is true and God is choosing the believer, you got nothing to worry about. Send them to college, have them study evolution. I wonder how many Christian parents of, let's say, 18 to 22-year-olds would feel comfortable with their children spending a cup of coffee with me and talking about these things after getting to know me, see my channel, see how I interact. I think a lot of Christian parents would say, no, stay away from Doug. But how sad is that? And if you're a Christian who is a parent listening to this right now, and you have I'm not going to talk to any person under 18, but an adult, legal adult, if you're a Christian parent listening to this, contact me, and we'll do a live stream, and I'll talk to your child. Would you be willing to do that? Have you inoculated your child well enough? that they could sustain the questioning from Doug? But again, what do you have to worry about if they're a true believer? No one can take them from the Father's hand, not even Doug. So you should be quite comfortable with sending your kids to college and having them talk to guys like me.
You're affiliated with, sir, but even some Christian colleges, you're going to find some skepticism and you're going to find some problems, and you're certainly going to find other kids who, even though they may say they're Christians, have a lot of doubts themselves, and they're going to pull your kids away. So in addition to inoculating them with evidence before they go to college, I think you also have to ensure that as soon as they get there, that they get involved in a Christian group, they hopefully get a Christian roommate, and they have some support on campus. Because if they don't have...
Well, this is interesting. Before you send your kids, if you're a Christian, before you send your kids to college, make sure they have, they're involved in a Christian group, have a Christian roommate, and have some like Christian support. Is your belief that fragile, Frank, that you need all these things to keep your child from leaving the faith? And again, use the outsider test for faith. Pretend I'm a Muslim. I'm not, but pretend I'm a Muslim. And I say to my children, you know what? Before you go to college, make sure you have a Muslim roommate. Make sure you get into the Muslim organizations, and you have that Muslim support system in place before you go. Because, you know, these Christians, they will get to you. They will try to change your mind on these things. So we need to make sure that you surround yourself with the protections of Islam so you do not fall from the faith. Frank, what would you say about that? Would you be for that? I'm sure you would understand that a Muslim parent would say such a thing. But here's the real issue, though, Frank. If we are valuing this thing called truth, and we're trying as a team to work together to figure out what is true and what is false, do you think the best way is to insulate yourself from other ideas? Do you think the best way is to put yourself in a cocoon and to keep everybody at arm's length who doesn't believe what you believe? I know, Frank, you're a older man and you can handle it, but are you saying that the young people today, that they're so fragile that they just would crumble to any question? Wouldn't you want your child to value truth so much that they're willing to admit that they're wrong? That you're wrong, Frank? Shouldn't they be commended for that?
Have that, they're going to be lone wolves and easily picked off.
Oh, it's wolves, not wolves.
In a very hostile environment. So I think they're going to have to do that. Now, with your comment regarding salt and light, I think obviously if you're a strong Christian and you can go to a secular school and be part of a campus group there, that's great, because you can be salt and light to those people who on a secular campus might not have any other Christians out there. So I think it's very critical that Christian students who are equipped go to some of these campuses and actually be the salt and light they need to be on campus.
Okay, so last thing he talks about, I really admire and I really respect what Frank says here. Let's see, minute 53. It's near the end. Here we go.
Your initial goal is to put a stone in their shoe about their worldview, because before they're going to accept your worldview, they've got to begin doubting their worldview. And all
Amen. I love it. Let me repeat what he said. I wrote it down. This is what Frank just said. Actually, let me rewind it. Listen to this.
Your initial goal is to put a stone in their shoe about their worldview, because before they're going to accept your worldview, they've got to begin doubting their worldview. And all this, by the way, is in the quick answer section of the cross-examined.
More marketing. A man's got to eat. Okay. You have to put a stone in their shoe. Before they accept your worldview, they have to begin doubting your worldview, their own worldview. So in other words, Frank's saying that doubt is a good thing. So for all you Christians out there who give me trouble that doubt is a virtue, I keep saying that doubt's a virtue, and you're saying, no, Doug, doubt's not a virtue. Frank here himself is saying, hey, before they can change their mind on their worldview, they have to first doubt it. Amen. And you have to put a stone in their shoe. What does he mean by that? He means like he has to ask questions. From a Christian perspective, you have to ask the atheist questions to put a stone in their shoes, something that they can be bothered by, and to get them to start thinking and doubting. So, Frank, isn't that what's happening in college campuses now? They're just taking your advice, Frank, but it's in reverse. So you are, I'm just going to say it, you are being a big old hypocrite here. You're saying that it's okay to put stones in the unbeliever's shoe and having them doubt, but it's not okay for your young people, Christian young people, for that to happen to them. I hope, Frank, you see this video someday and realize that that's what's happening. That's what you're saying. Okay, that was kind of harsh, but let me try to build a bridge here. The bridge I want to build here is, Frank, you and I both value truth. Frank, I am open to your God being true. I am open to miracles. Part of me wishes it was true. I wish I could see an amazing miracle. Frank, my sister is dying of MS. She's totally paralyzed except for her eyeballs and her mouth. I would love it, Frank, if you and some other pastors would come visit my sister, pray for her in the name of Jesus, and she would be immediately restored, gain all the muscle mass back, and run around. That would be the most amazing thing I'd ever seen in my life. I would love to see miracles. So I'm being honest. I'm open to that. Do I think that's ever happened? No. I've heard stories, but I've never seen it. And every time that I've investigated miracle claims, they seem to fall flat. So if we both value truth, and we both have these questions of where we come from, why we're here, how do we act morally, all these things. Instead of, this is where I think we're different. You get your answers from a book, an old book, that for some reason you've decided is true. You might say it's prophecies, you might say it's other things. But there are people smarter than us who have looked at the evidence that just don't see it. Now, that doesn't mean it's false, but Frank, isn't it better to be agnostic about it and say, you know what, it could be true, but really, if you were to see the same types of evidence in a belief you don't believe in, you would not accept it. It's because it's placed in your holy book that you do believe it. In a different holy book, you would say, no, it's wrong. So I would think that if you wanted to be a deist, if that gave you some comfort for first cause, okay. I still don't think there's good reasons to be a deist, but hey, if it floats your boat, why not? Maybe I regret saying that, but why choose this specific theism when all the evidence points, not all, but a lot of the evidence points to the fact that it doesn't meet the burden of proof? Extraordinary, you've talked to Hitchens, Frank. You know the Hitchens line. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Old texts of a man rising from the dead after 3 days, 2.5 days, is not extraordinary evidence. You and I could very quickly think of better evidence, very quickly. Maybe not better evidence for the time, but better evidence throughout the course of history. But the claim throughout the course of history hasn't changed. But for me to try to raise doubt in someone who makes a living off this is probably insanity.